Hello, weary traveller. Come, sit by my fire. The night is long, and the stars above hold many secrets. I am the lonely knight, and tonight I shall share with you an account about the strange things people did for fun in the Dark Ages, when the laughter of peasants and nobles alike echoed through muddy streets and candle-lit halls in ways that might bewilder the modern soul. Close your eyes, if you will, and let your mind drift back with me. Back to a time when the world was simpler, yet far more perilous, when a man's word was his bond, and steel sang its deadly song under the morning sun. But before we begin, tell me, fellow wanderer, from what distant land do you listen, and what time does your clock strike as my account reaches you? It brings me comfort to know when and where my voice is heard. The first time I rode into a tournament field, I was but a squire, holding my master's battered helm as the horns cried out across the green. The crowd pressed close behind wooden rails, eager for the clash, their breath visible in the morning chill. These were no harmless games. Though the lances were blunted, the fury was real. Men fought not only for honour, but for coin, for titles, and for the eyes of watching lords and ladies. It was both a rehearsal for war and a theatre of blood. At its core, the tournament was a festival of chivalry, swords crossing in mock combat that too often turned lethal. The melee was the grandest event, where knights fought in teams, mounted or afoot, until exhaustion or surrender took them. Bruised ribs and broken limbs were common, and now and then, a body was carried away, limp beneath the banners. And yet the crowds cheered louder when the danger rose. It thrilled them to see nobility brought low, even if only for a moment. The joust, more refined, more solitary, came to dominate the spectacle over the years. Two riders charged at each other with lowered lances, aiming to unhorse their opponent in a contest of precision and raw might. When done well, the lance shattered on impact in a cloud of splinters. When done poorly, it pierced through mail and bone. Still, for many, victory in the joust was the key to prestige, sometimes more valued than valor in actual battle. Outside the lists, the tournament grounds became a world of their own. Pavilions rose like a colourful forest of silk, each bearing the sigil of a house or region. Merchants sold food and relics, minstrels played their lutes, and matchmakers whispered promises in the ears of young nobles. It was there I first glimpsed the woman I would never marry, her smile lost to time, but her memory etched into my soul like the scars on my hands. Amid the dust and pageantry, life moved fast and hot. For those not born of noble blood, the tournaments were a rare window into the world of the elite. Peasants gathered by the hundreds, carrying baskets of bread and children on their shoulders. They placed bets, drank ale, and roared as knights tumbled from their horses. There was joy in the spectacle, yes, but also in the rare taste of equality, if only as spectators of the noble fall. In those moments, even the lowborn could judge their betters. But not all who fought were noble. In time, some wealthy merchants and seasoned men-at-arms bought their way into the lists. Their presence stirred disdain in the old bloodlines, yet they often fought with a hunger that the pampered lacked. I once saw a butcher's son from Ghent unseat a baron twice his rank. The baron's pride never recovered. It reminded us that skill, not station, was what mattered when iron met bone. The church frowned upon such violence, calling it sinful and vain, yet the clergy came all the same. Bishops blessed the tournaments, and monks copied names of victors into their ledgers. Some claimed it kept knights sharp for holy war, others that it softened the brutality of true battle. I knew it as something else entirely, a stage where we wore our armour not just for defence, but for display, a masquerade of violence dressed in virtue. Looking back, I see those days not with longing, but with quiet understanding. We craved meaning in the clamour. We masked our fears in steel and pageantry. And though many fell, many more rose, if only in that fleeting moment between the charge and the impact, when all the world held its breath. There are things I have witnessed that still haunt the quiet corners of my memory. and among them are the cries of beasts forced into bloodsport. In many towns I passed through, crowds would gather not for prayer or justice, but to watch a chained bear fend off a pack of snarling dogs. The bear, muzzled and maddened, would rear and swing its great limbs, while the dogs lunged, tore and fell back, only to charge again. The people shouted as if watching a tourney, but there was no honour in it, only pain disguised as sport. No region was free of it. In England, in France, even deep in the German woods, men bred dogs specifically for this vile entertainment. Muscular, low to the ground, their jaws locked with such fury that it sometimes took blades to separate them from their prey. The bear was not always alone. Boars, bulls, and even chained apes were sometimes brought forth for battle. Some of these creatures had been raised by hand, only to be turned loose into the ring of torment. It was not bravery that drove the spectators. It was hunger for spectacle. Nobles watched from raised platforms, sipping spiced wine, their laughter rising above the noise. Peasants clung to the fence posts, children on their hips, eyes wide with wonder or fear. The line between horror and fascination was razor thin, and it was often crossed without thought. The richer towns even constructed stone arenas for such events, mimicking the Romans of old. I stood in one once near Chartres, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. The echoes of screams, human and animal, lingered in the mortar. There was money in it, of course. Wagers were laid as easily as prayers. Would the bear kill 3 dogs before falling? Would the boar gore its handler? Coin passed quickly from hand to hand, and with it, a kind of fever. Even priests sometimes placed bets, though they rarely admitted it beyond confession. In times of famine or plague, when joy was rare and death common, people turned to whatever distraction they could find, even if that distraction screamed in agony. Some animals became infamous. I recall hearing of a bear named Grimbald, who survived a dozen fights and was paraded from town to town like a hero. They dressed him in crude armor and gave him a name, as if that made it less cruel. People tossed him scraps and blessed themselves for luck in his shadow. But in the end, he fell like all the rest. His death drew more cheers than his survival ever had. I remember thinking how strange it is that man grants fame even as he sharpens the knife. There were whispers of handlers who trained their beasts not to fight, but to entertain in gentler ways. Dancing bears on chains, monkeys dressed as knights. These performances softened the edges of brutality, but the laughter they brought often came with unease. We knew, deep down, that the whip was never far away. I once saw a bear flinch not at a child's cry, but at the sound of a drum. Its training had burned fear into its very bones. Such things are not easily forgotten. Attitudes toward animals were different in those days. Most were seen as tools, food, or symbols in sermons. Compassion was not absent, but it was not common either. Saints were praised for sparing birds or calming wolves, yet the common man rarely saw holiness in the eyes of a creature. If a beast could not plough, feed, or guard, it might well be made to bleed for amusement. Mercy was a luxury few could afford to offer. I have fought wars, seen men torn by arrows and swords, and yet the sight of a chained creature fighting for its life amid cheers disturbed me more than any battlefield. Not for the blood, but for the silence afterward, the way the crowd moved on, as if nothing had happened. There is a cruelty in indifference that leaves a deeper wound than any blade. Not all crowds gathered for celebration. I remember days when the square filled with murmurs long before sunrise, not for music or feast, but for death. The gallows creaked above the stones, casting long shadows in the morning light. Vendors set up stalls selling bread, cider, and sweets. Children clutched ribbons, and laughter mingled with the scent of meat roasting over fire. It was a strange dissonance, one man's final hour woven into a carnival of faces. Justice, they called it, though few cared for the crime once the rope was drawn. Executions were not quiet affairs. They were spectacles, rich in ceremony and ritual. The condemned was paraded through the streets, often beaten or mocked, and made to confess aloud before the crowd. Some wept, others cursed to the end. I once saw a woman accused of heresy sing as she climbed the scaffold, her voice rising like incense against the dawn. The crowd listened in awe, but still demanded her burning. It seemed they wanted both beauty and fire in the same breath. There were many ways to die before the public eye: hanging for theft, beheading for treason, burning for heresy, drowning for infanticide. Each method held its own rhythm, its own grim choreography. In France, the wheel was used, bones broken, until the body hung limp like a marionette. In parts of the empire, flaying or boiling was known. Yet no matter the horror, the people came in droves. They came not out of malice, I think, but out of fascination with the edge between life and silence. Justice was meant to deter. That was the claim from every pulpit and palace. But I watched the same faces return to the square again and again, not to learn fear, but to feed a hunger. They brought their children, as if to teach them something, though I never knew what. I saw boys laugh when the axe fell. I saw a girl faint as a thief was quartered. And I saw mothers brush crumbs from their lips as the final breath escaped. Death became a lesson, but not always the one intended. The executioners were both feared and revered. Hooded or barefaced, they lived on the edge of society, needed but shunned. They were craftsmen of death, some with steady hands and quiet eyes, others showmen who played to the crowd. A swift blade earned applause, a clumsy stroke, and murmurs spread like wildfire. I once spoke with such a man, who told me he prayed more than any priest. "I hold their sin and mine," he said, "and still I must eat." He drank alone that night. Clergy often presided over the deaths, offering last rites or harsh sermons. They held crucifixes before the dying, and urged repentance with voices loud enough to reach the back rows. Yet even they could not contain the noise. The crowd jostled, gossiped, and shouted over the final words. In theory, it was a moment of divine reckoning. In practice, it was theatre. And like any performance, it required an audience willing to suspend their mercy for a few hours. Sometimes the condemned spoke to the people, confessions, accusations, or strange riddles. Their words, if memorable, would be repeated in taverns for days. I heard once of a man who, before the noose tightened, whispered, "Tell the king I forgive him." That line was etched into local legend, though whether it was true, I cannot say. The dead could not correct the tale. In death, they became something more than flesh. They became memory shaped by the mouths of others. Now, when I pass by empty scaffolds or abandoned execution grounds, I find the silence heavier than the noise that once filled those spaces. The echo of cheers and weeping lingers in the stones. I wonder if justice was ever truly served, or if we simply learned to make peace with our own cruelty by turning it into ceremony. The rope may fray, the blade may dull, but the memory of watching still binds us. There were days when the bells rang not for mass, but for merriment. Feast days marked on every villager's soul like ink on vellum. When such days arrived, even the most solemn monks loosened their robes and joined the songs that drifted across fields and stone walls. It began with prayer, yes, but it never ended there. Ale flowed like river water, pies steamed on wooden boards, and dancing turned the streets into sanctuaries of laughter. The holy and the profane sat side by side, arms linked in songs that had no place in a psalter. Every village had its own way of rejoicing. In Normandy, I saw men paint their faces with ash and chase pigs through the streets, while in the Low Countries, whole families built makeshift stages and performed absurd tales drawn from scripture, twisted for jest. These were not quiet affairs. Noise was sacred, fiddles scraping, boots stamping, voices raised in cheer or argument. It was as if the world needed to scream joyfully to remember it still could. Much of the celebration was rooted in the church calendar, Easter, Pentecost, Corpus Christi, but the way they were kept would make a bishop blush. On the feast of St. Martin, for instance, wine cellars were emptied in his honor, and more than once I've seen a priest so deep in his cups he could barely pronounce the blessing. It was accepted, even expected. The saints, it was said, understood the joy of creation. And if the wine was sweet, so much the better for praising heaven. Men and women alike cast off restraint. I've seen pious widows dance barefoot in the mud, their grey hair braided with wildflowers. I've heard chaste maidens sing songs that would make a sailor cough into his cup. For one day, virtue gave way to release, and no one seemed to mind. Life was short, fragile, and too often cruel. Feast days were the balm, the sanctioned chaos that reminded the poor they were still alive. Children roamed in packs, chasing each other through legs and carts, mouths sticky with honey and sweat. They played games, many of which I never understood, but their laughter filled the corners that hunger usually claimed. Dogs barked, pigs squealed, fires roared with roasting meat, and even the sick were brought out to feel the sun on their faces. I remember sitting beside a toothless woman who hadn't spoken in weeks. That day, she sang, a hymn, or perhaps a memory. I never asked which. Not all revelry was gentle. Fights broke out when ale soured or words were poorly chosen. I once watched a man strike his own brother over a game of dice played with bones. Yet even these scuffles seemed to carry less venom than usual. They passed like storms, loud, wet, and quickly forgotten. In the end, someone always offered bread, or a song, or a shoulder, and peace returned. These feasts had a way of disarming pride, if only briefly. The line between sacred and vulgar was never clear. A cross might hang over a table where lovers kissed, or a relic might be passed around between cups of mead. The clergy scolded, of course, but they too swayed to the music. Perhaps we all sensed deep down that joy could be holy, that laughter was a kind of prayer when sung from a grateful chest. It was not blasphemy, it was survival. And when the fires died and the stars took their place, the village grew quiet, save for the last drunken songs lingering under doorways. The earth felt softer on such nights, as if it too had feasted. I lay once beneath a pear tree after such a day, listening to the slow breath of sleeping cattle and distant snoring. In that silence, joy echoed louder than any sermon. It was in the dead of winter, when snow clung to rooftops and breath turned to smoke, that the mummers came. Without warning, they would pour into the square, faces hidden behind crude masks of leather, horn, or painted cloth, chanting songs no priest would ever bless. Their arrival stirred both excitement and unease. Children ran to them with wide eyes, while elders muttered prayers behind closed shutters. No one truly knew where they came from, and that was part of the magic, or the fear. The mummers did not ask permission to perform. They burst into homes uninvited, danced across hearths, and delivered jests as sharp as knives. Sometimes they brought gifts, bread shaped like doves or coins tied in cloth, but other times they demanded ale or meat in exchange for silence. Refuse them, and your chimney might be smeared with ash, your doorway marked with some strange symbol. There was mischief in their bones, and perhaps a touch of something older than mischief. Their performances were strange things, half play, half ritual. I once saw a mummer act out a mock birth, crawling from beneath a fur cloak to the laughter of drunk villagers. Another time, a man in a deer's skull pretended to die and rise again, chased by others dressed as wolves. To us, it was absurdity, but to them, I think, it held some echo of forgotten rites. A memory of the forest hidden beneath layers of laughter and wine. They wore the faces of animals, saints, kings, and demons. A goat with bells, a crow with a painted beak, a skeleton with bones carved from breadsticks. The masks were crude, yet there was something about them that unsettled even the bravest knight. They said things no one else dared say. mocked lords to their faces, teased bishops with scandalous riddles. But because they were not themselves, they were untouchable. That was the power of the mask. Women, too, took part, though often hidden among the men, their voices disguised, their laughter sharper. I remember one who called herself the Moon and danced alone in the village square under torchlight, dressed in silver cloth. No one stopped her, not even the reeve. That night, the old rules seemed to fall away like leaves from a tree. For a few hours, all was inversion. Servants became kings, fools became prophets, and the world tilted on its head. Some believed the mummers brought luck, others swore they summoned devils. The church never quite knew what to do with them. Edicts were issued, then ignored. Bishops preached against them, then laughed when they appeared in their own halls. Like many things in our world, they existed in the space between condemnation and indulgence. A mirror, perhaps, to the contradictions we all carried inside. We feared them, yes, but we also waited for their return. There was a time when I joined them, though only once. I wore a fox's mask and followed them through muddy lanes, speaking only in riddles and rhymes. That night, I saw a village elder kiss a stable boy beneath the guise of comedy, and no one blinked. I realized then the strange mercy of the mask. It allowed truth to step into daylight disguised as jest. Behind the absurdity, there was something honest, perhaps even sacred. When dawn approached, the mummers vanished like mist. No farewells, no thanks. Just silence and muddy footprints in the snow. The village returned to its rules, its chores, its hierarchies. But for one night, we had glimpsed another world. A world where everything could be questioned, if only from behind a painted face. And though the masks were gone, their laughter echoed for days in every corner of the cold. Once, while winter still held the hills in its grip, I wandered into a town just before Lent and found it turned inside out. The cobbler wore a bishop's hat, the baker dressed in silk like a queen, and children paraded a mock pope made of straw through the streets. Laughter clanged louder than church bells, and no man seemed bound by law or station. It was carnival, a sacred misrule permitted by those who usually demanded order. And for a handful of days, the world danced on its head. The heart of the revelry was inversion. Lords scrubbed stables while serfs judged them from makeshift thrones. Women donned armor and led fake processions through the town, their voices deepened to absurdity. I once saw a mute beggar crowned as king for a day, his orders obeyed with laughter and drink. It was not rebellion, but something more peculiar, a ritual mocking of power, allowed only because it was fleeting. By dusk, the crown would vanish, and the real rulers would return. There was one day, known as the Feast of Fools, when even the clergy surrendered dignity. In some places, young boys were named bishops, carried through the cathedral, and allowed to preach nonsense from the pulpit. They wore vestments backward, sang hymns in animal sounds, and blessed the crowd with sausages instead of incense. The older priests grumbled, but many chuckled behind their hands. I remember one canon who laughed so hard he spilled his wine down his cassock and didn't even flinch. Masks played their part again, as they often did in our merriest and darkest customs. But these were not like the mummers' wild faces. These were grotesque parodies, cardinals with donkey ears, monks with stuffed bellies, kings with painted warts. The people cheered as sacred robes were mimicked and mocked, and though some feared divine wrath, others claimed God himself must surely understand the need for such release. A world without laughter, they said, is more dangerous than a world with too much. Food and drink knew no bounds. Pies larger than wheels, loaves shaped like genitals or fish, and barrels of ale that seemed to refill themselves by miracle or mischief. Songs rose that no choir would dare transcribe. I heard verses that rhymed sin with salvation, that named saints and jesting tales of drunkenness and lust. They were sung boldly, shamelessly, without fear. In those moments, It was as if the soul had permission to breathe unguarded. Not every town approved. Some banned such festivities outright, calling them blasphemy or devilry. But such bans rarely lasted. People need foolishness as much as they need fasting. In truth, the church itself often walked both paths, condemning with one hand and pardoning with the other. I've known bishops who secretly funded carnival troops, hiding coins in alms for the joy of the people. Joy, after all, was hard won in those years. Laughter did not come cheaply. It is easy to forget how powerful mockery can be. To laugh at power is to soften its grip. For peasants, carnival was not escape, it was recognition. A chance to say, "We see you," to the proud and the pious, and do so with grins instead of swords. And perhaps that's why it was tolerated. Laughter broke no walls, spilled no noble blood, but reminded the world that beneath every crown there is a skull waiting its turn. When the carnival ended, ash was smeared on foreheads, meat vanished from plates, and silence crept back into the streets. But for those brief, chaotic days, the world dared to look at itself sideways and laugh. And in that laughter, I heard something rare and human, a kind of wisdom that comes not from solemn faces, but from foolish ones wearing bells. There is a silence that clings to the halls of power, one that only a fool is allowed to break. In the courts of kings and dukes, where words are measured like coin, it was the jester who could speak freely, wrapped in motley cloth and sharp wit. I remember one in particular, a bent man with eyes like polished glass, who once told a duke he ruled like a goat with a crown. The court gasped, but the duke laughed, and in that laugh I saw the fool's strange immunity at work. Jesters were not merely clowns, they were mirrors. Their songs carried barbs, their stories held warnings, and their jests often bore truths no knight dared voice. A well-placed quip could deflate a swollen ego faster than a sword. They danced with danger, towing the line between ridicule and offence. Some were crippled, others disfigured, and many trained from youth in the art of misdirection. To be a fool required more cunning than courage, and more courage than most could bear. Their tools were simple: a cap with bells, a stick shaped like a man, perhaps a drum or flute. But with these, they wove spells of disruption and delight. They juggled apples while speaking of famine, mimicked lords as crows cawing orders, and played at madness to expose the madness of power. In Bohemia, I saw a fool halt a feast with a single riddle, sending a bishop into a rage and a queen into tears. Such was their strange reach. Not all jesters were welcomed. Some were beaten or cast out when their words cut too deep. Others, protected by affection or fear, lived long in the service of courts. In England, they called them licensed fools, as if permission made their heresies safer. Yet the best of them served as more than entertainment. They were shadows that reminded kings they were still men, and laughter that soothed the poisoned air of too much obedience. There were female fools too, though rarer. I once heard of a woman in Aragon who sang truths in the form of lullabies, weaving gossip into lull and rhyme. She survived 3 monarchs and buried 2. Her legacy lived on in whispers, and her name was never written down. The court feared her, but they could not do without her. She made them laugh when no one else dared, and she alone could bring tears without drawing steel. To the outsider they seemed mad. But madness is often a cloak worn by those who understand too much. I have seen fools speak in rhyme so complex it left scholars stammering, or act drunk while watching the whole court like a hawk. Their bodies bent, their speech twisted, but their minds were sharp as whetted blades. They knew when to jest, when to bite, and when to fall silent. That silence was their deadliest trick. And still, they were lonely creatures, their faces painted, their lives spent in service to those who would never call them equal. They dined at the edge of the feast, laughed with mouths that hid tired hearts. I once shared bread with one in a castle's cold corridor. He told me the hardest part was remembering which laugh was real. I understood him more than he knew. Even now, when I hear bells in the distance, I think not of cattle or churches, but of fools, those strange prophets in patchwork, dancing along the edge of every throne. They were not jesters of nonsense. They were guardians of uncomfortable truth. And when they fell silent, the world... Even now, when I hear bells in the distance, I think not of cattle or churches, but of fools, those strange prophets in patchwork, dancing along the edge of every throne. They were not jesters of nonsense. They were guardians of uncomfortable truth. And when they fell silent, the world often grew too proud. Along the muddy roads of pilgrimage towns, I often stumbled upon wooden stages rising like altars before crowds of the faithful and the curious alike. These were not for sermons or decrees, but for drama. Mystery plays performed beneath open sky. Sacred stories drawn from scripture were acted out by butchers, bakers, and smiths who had rehearsed them with reverence and pride. They wore robes fashioned from old curtains, crowns made of reeds, wings of painted cloth. It was theatre, yes, but for many, it was the only Bible they would ever see. Entire towns became part of the performance. In York, the cycle of plays took days to unfold, each craft guild performing a different scene, from creation to Judgment Day. I once watched the fall of Lucifer played atop a wagon drawn by oxen, the actor dangling from ropes as firecrackers burst below. The crowd gasped and crossed themselves, some weeping, others laughing. It was not polished, but it was powerful. The word became flesh, not in the churches, but in the streets. I recall a depiction of Noah's Ark, where the actor playing Noah argued bitterly with his wife, who refused to board until she fetched her spinning wheel. The people roared with laughter, and yet the rain scene that followed moved them to silence. These plays danced between holy awe and human folly. They brought heaven to eye level and made the divine feel less distant, less untouchable. In them, the saints walked among butchers and weavers, and miracles unfolded beside market stalls. Some troupes took the performances further, adding devils that leapt into the crowd, sinners dragged screaming to mock hells filled with smoke and shrieking. I saw children cry in terror and monks nod in approval. These dramatizations were more than entertainment. They were lessons in morality, painted in fire and shadow. Fear played its part in salvation, and the devil's laughter often lingered longer than the angel. We learned through spectacle what sermons could not always reach. The church watched these dramas with both delight and caution. Bishops blessed the scripts, but censored lines that cut too close to doctrine. There were debates in abbeys over whether laughter had a place in holy things, but the people had already decided. They gathered in rain and snow to see the stories come alive. A man who could not read knew the parables by heart because he saw them danced and shouted before his eyes. Faith lived not just in books, but in breath and sweat. I remember the smell of roasted onions and wet wool as I stood shoulder to shoulder with peasants and merchants, watching Judas hang himself from a tree carved from old beams. No one moved, no one spoke. The silence after his death rang louder than the bells of any cathedral. That is what these plays could do, pierce through noise and hunger and doubt, and leave only stillness. For a moment, even the loudest cynic seemed to pray. As years passed, the plays grew more elaborate. Trapdoors, painted backdrops, and mechanical beasts became part of the craft. But something was lost in that grandeur. The rawness, the closeness of the old wagons faded. I missed the days when Gabriel's wings were crooked and Christ's robe was too short. Imperfection made it honest. I do not know if heaven noticed, but I believe it smiled more often then. And now, when I hear villagers chant old verses or children pretend to be kings and prophets in the fields, I remember those early days of sacred drama, when faith walked on stage with muddy boots and salvation smelled faintly of cider and smoke. Those plays may be gone, but the stories remain, carried not by parchment, but by memory, passed from lips to hearts in the fading light of day. When the year turned its wheel and the light began to shift, we gathered around fire not for warmth alone, but for something older, something deeper. I stood once in a clearing as great flames leapt toward the heavens, casting wild shadows on the trees. It was Midsummer's Eve, and the entire village had come, their faces aglow, eyes filled with that ancient mix of joy and fear. There was music, yes, and dancing, but it was the fire that ruled the night. Its crackle spoke louder than any words. These gatherings were more than celebration. They were rites, cloaked in festivity. We leapt over embers to ward off illness, tossed herbs into the blaze for good fortune, and circled the flames hand in hand, singing songs older than the saints. In the east, I saw lovers jump the fire together. If they landed still holding hands, it was said their bond would not break. There was wisdom in these customs, though much of it was never written down. It lived in gestures and smoke. At All Hallows Tide, the fire bore a different meaning. Then it was to drive away spirits, to light the path between the living and the dead. I remember a man who swore he saw his mother's face in the flames that night, her eyes calm, her mouth unmoving. Whether he truly saw her or only wished to, none could say. But many nodded. The fire had a way of revealing what we buried inside ourselves. Children ran with torches, drawing circles in the air, their laughter ringing like bells. We baked soul cakes and left them on thresholds, whispering names into the night. There was fear, but also comfort, in believing the dead still listened. The church tried to replace these fires with candles at altars, but the people clung to the old ways. After all, the fire was not only about death, it was life made visible, made untouchable. It reminded us that light can dance, even in the coldest hours. In some places, effigies were burned, figures made of straw or old clothes, sometimes given names. It was said they carried the village's misfortune into the flames. I once helped raise such a figure, stuffing its limbs with thorns and coins. When it burned, we shouted curses, laughed, and drank until dawn. The next morning, the air felt different, lighter somehow. Perhaps the magic was only in our minds, but in hard years, even that was enough. The fires brought together those who might not speak on other days. Quarrels were paused, debts forgotten, if only for a night. I saw enemies share drink beside the same flame, their faces softened by the light. Old songs were sung without shame, hands reached out in reconciliation. It was as if the fire consumed not just wood, but pride, and left behind something more tender. We did not speak of it the next day, but we remembered. Sometimes the fire went wrong. A spark in a thatched roof, a careless hand, and joy turned to panic. I saw a barn burn once during a feast, taking with it all of one man's winter grain. Yet even then, the community gathered, gave what they could, and rebuilt. That was the risk of fire. It gave and it took. But always, it drew us close. Its danger made its warmth feel earned. Even now, when I sit before my own small flame, I feel the echo of those old festivals. The faces may have changed, the songs may have faded, but the need remains. We still crave light in darkness, still gather to remember that warmth exists. And though no one leaps through the flames tonight, I watch them rise and think, this too is a kind of prayer. One spoken in crackles and sparks, offered to whatever listens beyond the stars. My feet have touched more roads than I can count, but few were as strange and alive as those trodden in pilgrimage. The holy journeys we took were not only for penance or prayer, they were voyages of escape, of curiosity, even amusement. I remember setting out for Santiago with a band of strangers who soon felt like kin. We told stories by moonlight, shared crusts of bread, and laughed more than we wept. It was said the road purified the soul, but often it simply reminded us we were still human. Shrines dotted the path like stars along the sky. Some held relics, a bone of St. Andrew, a fragment of Mary's veil. Others merely claimed them. We stopped anyway, A cracked vial said to contain Christ's tears drew a line so long it spilled into the next village. Whether it was true mattered less than what it offered. A sense of touch to the unseen. People kissed glass, knelt on stone, whispered wishes they'd never dare speak aloud. There were merchants along the way, of course. They sold scallop shells and ribbons, wooden statues and charms said to ward off demons or blisters. One man in Canterbury sold bottled holy wind, caught from the hill where a saint had once sneezed. We laughed, but someone bought it. Pilgrimage blurred the lines between sacred and strange, between reverence and folly. And perhaps that was its true nature, a holy path paved with very human feet. In taverns and fields, tales flowed freely. Some pilgrims walked in silence, heads bowed in solemn prayer. Others sang bawdy songs, played dice, and flirted with every face that turned their way. There was no single way to journey. I met a blind woman who followed only the sound of bells, and a boy who walked barefoot to atone for theft. We judged none of them. On the road, we were all equal beneath the dust. Dangers were many. Robbers waited in shadowed woods, and sickness spread easily in crowded hostels. I saw a man die from fever 2 days before reaching Rome. We buried him with a piece of the map he had carried close to his heart. His name was never written in any book of saints, but I remember it. Every step we took was a gamble between grace and grave. And still, we walked. There was joy, too, in the absurd. In Spain, I passed a shrine where pilgrims balanced shoes on their heads while circling a statue of Saint Barbara. No one knew why, but everyone did it. In France, a town offered indulgences to those who could whistle a hymn while standing on one leg. These things seemed foolish until you did them. Then they became part of the journey, part of the quiet bond shared by all who dared to wander in faith. Sometimes pilgrims returned transformed. Other times they came back as they had left, only with blisters and stories. A few never returned at all. Yet even in failure, there was a kind of success. The road itself had been walked. The dust clung to our cloaks like memory. The prayers whispered beneath foreign stars echoed long after our boots were removed. We came seeking salvation, and instead found each other. Even now the sound of distant bells stirs my feet. Though I no longer walk the long miles, I still recall the rhythm of that pilgrimage heart. Hope, pain, laughter, silence, repeated step by step. It was never only about the holy destination. It was about the faces met, the roads shared, the silence endured. We walked not just toward shrines, but toward ourselves, one strange and sacred mile at a time. It began, they say, with a single woman, her feet moving to music no one else could hear, her body jerking like a puppet pulled by unseen strings. That was in Strasbourg, the summer of 1518, though I had seen such madness once before in Flanders. At first people laughed, thinking it a jest or drunken game, but the dance did not end. Hours passed, then days. More joined her, until dozens filled the streets, trembling and stomping as if the earth itself possessed them. Laughter turned to dread. The physicians came, their faces pale beneath their robes, claiming it was hot blood or too much melancholy. They suggested music to ease the affliction. So musicians were summoned and drums filled the square. But the rhythm only deepened the frenzy. Men collapsed in fits. Women bled from the soles of their feet. Some died mid-step, their final breath stolen between the beat and the silence. And still the others danced. The city watched in helpless horror. No spell was spoken, no demon clearly named. Yet something passed between the bodies like fire through dry grass. Some believed it was divine punishment, St. Vitus exacting a strange penitence. Others whispered of poison or of witches' curses drifting through the air like smoke. I do not pretend to know. But I saw it once with my own eyes, a child of no more than 10, twirling and weeping, arms lifted to a sky that offered no answer. This was not the only time such fever struck. In Aachen, Erfurt, and Metz, the dance took hold in years past. Always the same. Music without joy. Movement without will. I heard of one woman who danced for 6 nights straight, sleeping only when she fell unconscious, waking only to move again. Her mother tied her to a post to stop her. But even there, bound and bleeding, her legs still trembled in rhythm. What shadow walks beside such sorrow? The church responded with processions, relics, and prayers. They marched the afflicted to shrines, laid hands upon their heads, sang hymns into the air as if to drown out the ghostly tune. Sometimes it worked, though whether through faith or exhaustion, I cannot say. Other times, nothing changed. The dancing burned itself out like a storm, leaving behind only broken bodies and fearful hearts. We called it a miracle when it ended, but no one rejoiced. What troubled me most was the way people followed. Not just the afflicted, but the watchers. Some swayed without knowing it. Some clapped in rhythm before realizing their hands had moved. It was as if the line between self and other had worn thin. In the face of fear, people reached for understanding, even if it meant joining the madness. It reminded me of war. How quickly order dissolves when reason is replaced by rhythm and need. Scholars in later years claimed it was sickness or mass hysteria born from famine and grief. Perhaps they are right. Life in those days was brittle, and the mind can crack more easily than bone. But the way it moved, like a wind through wheat, like a whisper too loud to ignore, spoke of something deeper. A wound in the soul of the world, festering in silence, until it screamed through the feet of the forgotten. I still remember the sound of those dancers. No music, just the thud of soles on stone, the ragged breath, the weeping. It was not a dance of joy or celebration, but of desperation. As if by moving, they could escape something that followed too closely. And though I stood still, I felt it in my marrow, that pull, that ache, that cry. Sometimes, even now, my foot taps in the dark. And I wonder. There was a time when truth was not sought with parchment or witnesses, but by the edge of steel and the weight of water. I once stood in a circle of men as 2 combatants faced each other, one a knight, the other a stable hand accused of theft. No jury, no confession, only 2 swords and the belief that God would not let the guilty stand. It was not justice as we know it now, but justice as we feared it, fast, brutal, and final. The crowd held its breath, waiting not for truth, but for blood. Trial by combat was not limited to nobles, though they favoured it most. I saw monks plead with lords to spare men from the fight, but often pride drowned mercy. Each fighter swore an oath before the church, arms bare, faces solemn. If the accused bested the accuser, he walked free, his innocence declared not by reason, but by survival. If he lost, it was proof enough of guilt. Few questioned it aloud. To do so was to question God's own judgment. In other places, the trials took different forms. There was the ordeal of water, where the accused was bound and cast into a river. If he sank, he was innocent, but drowned. If he floated, guilt was presumed, and punishment followed. I watched this once, helpless as a woman accused of adultery struggled against her bindings, her eyes wide with terror. She floated. The village nodded. That was all it took. No one spoke of her again. There were trials by fire as well. I recall one in Cologne where a man carried a red-hot iron across the square, wrapped in linen. His hand was then bound and sealed for 3 days. If the wound festered, he was condemned. If it healed clean, he was absolved. The priest declared the result divine, though I saw how carefully the bandage was tended by his mother. Some said the saints favoured him. Others said his mother knew herbs the priest did not. These ordeals, though cruel, were wrapped in ceremony. Banners were raised, relics brought forth, and blessings spoken in Latin. It was as if the ritual made the brutality more bearable. People dressed in their best, brought food, and treated the event like a fair. I remember one child licking honey from her fingers as a man screamed beneath boiling oil. Such contradictions were common. We did not separate justice from spectacle. We swallowed both with the same bread. Not all trials ended in death. Some left survivors maimed, shunned, or broken in spirit. I met a woman once who had walked the ordeal of 9 crosses, 9 paces barefoot across plowshares heated in flame. Her feet never healed, but her name was cleared, and that was enough for the world, if not for her. She spoke softly, her words few, but her eyes carried the weight of those iron steps until the day she died. The church tried in time to curb these customs. Bishops argued for inquiry and reason, for councils and confession, but change came slowly. In the minds of many, divine truth was not something spoken, it was something revealed through pain. To suffer was to be tested, and to survive suffering was to be seen. We trusted wounds more than words. Now, when I pass empty fields where such trials once took place, the silence feels sacred, not for the justice served, but for the cries once heard there. The earth remembers what we forget. And though the swords have rusted and the fire's gone cold, the ghosts of those judged by combat and ordeal still walk quietly beside the living. Down the crooked alleys of every market town, laughter spilled not just from taverns, but from makeshift stages of wood and cloth. Puppeteers stood behind curtains stitched from old blankets, their hands hidden, their voices strange and many. Wooden figures danced, argued, wept, and plotted beneath painted skies. The crowds, young and old, gathered close, pressing forward with sticky fingers and open mouths. It was not grandeur they came for, but familiarity. These were tales they knew, made new by mischief. The stories were simple, sometimes sacred, often scandalous. Saints wrestled with devils who farted fire, peasants outwitted greedy landlords, and animals spoke with the wisdom of drunk monks. I remember one puppet called Mother Groat, who scolded the crowd as much as the other characters. She called us sinners and fools, and we howled with joy. The figures were crude, their joints stiff, but their words cut deep. Truth had a way of slipping through wooden lips. Not all welcomed such revelry. I've seen clergy cross themselves and turn away when the devil puppet took the stage. But even priests smiled when no one watched. The humour was rough, yes, but it touched something ancient, something earthy. We laughed not to forget the weight of life, but to carry it more lightly. In the jests of puppets, we found what sermons sometimes lacked, the right to mock our own misery. Sometimes the show turned darker. I saw a play in Bruges where death came in the shape of a smiling doll, leading kings and beggars alike off stage. The children clapped, not knowing the depth of what they'd seen. Their parents stood quiet, hands folded. These performances held a strange power. They entertained, yes, but they also reminded. Beneath the jest, the bone. Beneath the chuckle, the chill. Street actors without puppets performed too, dressed in patched robes, faces smeared with coal or flour. They juggled truths between lines of nonsense, slipping criticism of lords and bishops into tales of animals or lovers. One troupe I followed through Flanders had a pig who could speak Latin, though it was clearly the butcher behind a curtain. Still, the crowd adored it, and if the bishop heard himself mocked in the pig's squeal, he said nothing. Perhaps he laughed too. Children mimicked the shows in courtyards and fields, fashioning their own puppets from scraps of wool and carved spoons. They gave them names, built tiny stages from crates, and performed for chickens and each other. In their voices, I heard echoes of the same joy, the same hunger for story, for laughter, for seeing the world turned upside down if only for a moment. The puppets made the mighty small and the small mighty. These performers lived on little, travelling from fair to fair, village to village. They slept in barns, begged for coin, and endured mockery from those who did not understand them. Yet they carried with them something rare, the gift of reflection without punishment. I once gave my cloak to a puppeteer who'd lost his to rain. In return, he told me a story I still carry, though it ended with the puppet being eaten by a goose. Now, when I hear laughter in the distance, I sometimes wonder if it's a play being told by candlelight to a new crowd. The words may change, the dolls replaced, but the need remains. We all crave mirrors that don't glare, voices that tease without wounding. In those old wooden faces, chipped and smiling, we found the courage to laugh at the world and at ourselves. It was often said that in our alehouses, the truth flowed freer than in any court. The warmth of spiced drink, the glow of fire, and the company of laughter forged a sanctuary of strange honesty. Beneath low-beamed ceilings stained with smoke, men and women gathered not only to drink, but to play, to jest, to lose themselves. I have heard more confessions in a tavern than I ever did in a chapel. And more lies too, but softer ones, wrapped in cheer and ale. The games were many and rarely wise. One involved passing a cup while reciting saints' names, and if you hesitated, you drank twice. Another demanded that you sing a verse or be drenched with cold water. I once joined a contest where each man swore an oath, more absurd than the last. Mine was that I'd joust the moon if she looked at me wrong. We laughed so hard, one man nearly fell through the door. No gold was wagered, only pride. Women joined freely, especially in towns where the rules bent with the night. Some drank more than the men, and some sang louder. I knew a washerwoman in York who could outdrink a smith twice her size and still recite psalms backward. She was not mocked for it. She was crowned Lady of the Bench for a week. Alehouses made room for roles that did not exist in daylight. Status melted in drink like frost at dawn. Stories were currency in those walls. You earned your place at the table by the tale you told, or the tune you carried. I heard accounts of ghosts in abbey cellars, of chickens that laid black eggs, of lords who wept during thunder. Some were false, some were dreams, but none were wasted. The telling was the treasure. Silence, in such places, was the only unwelcome guest. Not all nights ended in song. Fists were raised when pride soured, or when ale loosened tongues too far. I've seen friends turn foes and strangers embrace like brothers within the same hour. A tankard can be both blessing and curse. Yet even the brawls had a kind of ritual. Afterward, someone always fetched bread, someone else patched the bruises, and the next night, the same faces returned. Ale, like life, forgives more than it should. The church frowned upon these gatherings, of course. Drinking led to temptation, to sloth, to heresy. Yet I often saw monks at the edge of the crowd, cloaks drawn tight, sipping quietly, listening. One told me he came not for the drink, but for the songs. He missed the laughter of the world. I understood him. In the echoes of those halls, there was something ancient, a remembrance of joy before fear took its throne. Many of the games had meanings lost to time. Why we threw bones or balanced spoons on our noses, no one could say, but we did it still. The gestures became sacred in their silliness, carrying the weight of memory. We played not to win, but to remember we could still play at all. When the world was cold and work unending, foolishness became a kind of bread. Nourishment for the soul, if not the body. Sometimes now, beside this quiet fire, I hear a song echo faintly from my past, a tavern ballad sung off-key with claps and stomps. And I smile, though none are here to see it. For in those crowded rooms, beneath beams that creaked with laughter, we were not escaping life. We were entering it sideways, through ale and jest and foolish games that made the dark seem a little less heavy. In certain corners of the year, when frost left the fields or sun lingered too long, something peculiar stirred in the villages. Men wrapped in sackcloth, covered in feathers or fur, pranced through the streets on wooden legs. Some wore horns, others long snouts, and a few cloaked their faces in painted masks that bore no name. These were not actors, nor beasts, but both, a strange in-between. We called them the hobby horse and his kin, and their arrival meant the world was about to turn. No one quite agreed on what they were. Some said they scared away evil, others claimed they brought fertility to soil and woman alike. I once asked an old weaver what they meant, and she just smiled, toothless, and whispered, "What must be known already is." The costumes were clumsy, made of blankets, bones, leather, and bells, yet when they moved, something shifted in the air. Even the boldest child kept close to her mother's skirts. The hobby horse itself was often the most unsettling. A man hidden beneath a horse's head, sometimes carved, sometimes just cloth and eyes, would gallop through the crowd, snapping its wooden jaws and whinnying like a demon. People laughed, but they also stepped back. There was power in that play, though none could name it. I watched one chase a blacksmith into a pond, and everyone swore the smith's tools never rusted again. Stories clung to these beasts like smoke. It wasn't only horses. In Kent, I saw a man dressed as a stag, crowned with real antlers, move silently through the night, stopping at every door to leave a sprig of holly. No words, no music, just presence. In Wales, they carried a mare's skull on a pole, cloaked in white cloth, led from house to house while the people inside sang riddles before letting it enter. The beast would reply in verse. And if it won, it came inside for drink and dance. Women took part as well, though often their roles were masked further. Some danced as geese or goats, their steps frantic, their laughter wild. I remember one woman cloaked in ivy, her face streaked with ash, who whispered fortunes through the mouth of a badger mask. She told me I would see death in spring. And that year, my brother did not rise from winter's fever. Whether she guessed or knew, I never asked again. There were times when the church forbade such acts, claiming they were remnants of pagan rites best left buried. But the people clung to them. They had danced with beasts before kings were crowned and before saints found their altars. These were older truths, dressed in foolishness. And if they wore the shape of animals, it was perhaps to remind us that we too are not so far from tooth and hoof. Children watched with wide eyes, torn between fear and awe. Some wept, some chased the dancers, mimicking their steps with sticks and laughter. The old nodded from doorways, remembering their own turns beneath the mask. The young did not understand the meaning, but they felt it. Felt the shift in wind, the tremble of something ancient stepping through the veil. We did not need to explain. The dance spoke where words fell short. Even now, when I see a branch sway strangely in the night, or hear a wooden creak with no wind to cause it, I wonder if the beasts still walk. Not in malice, but in memory. They wore no crowns, no titles, yet they ruled the day with mystery and motion. For one breath of time, we were allowed to be wild again, draped in feathers, hooves, and silence, and the world, for a fleeting moment, remembered its own forgotten face. In some seasons, marriage became a jest, and the altar a stage. I witnessed it once during carnival in a northern village where rules were made to be broken, then laughed at. They dressed a pig farmer as a blushing bride and gave him a veil of nettles. His groom was a cooper who wore a bishop's stole and carried a staff carved from broomstick. The crowd cheered as they walked arm in arm, solemn as saints, down the muddy lane. All knew it was folly, but all played along. The ceremony followed its own absurd script. The priest read vows from a torn book of riddles, and the rings were made of cheese. When he asked if any opposed the union, a boy shouted, "Only hunger," and was answered with a loaf thrown from the crowd. The kiss was dramatic, ridiculous, and met with roaring approval. I laughed until my ribs ached, and yet beneath the laughter something stirred, mockery laced with memory. These unions were not always between men. I saw women married to scarecrows, men wed to goats carved from bread. Sometimes children officiated, raising their voices in high, trembling chants. One girl declared her rooster the new lord of the village and crowned it with a daisy wreath. Such chaos was not born from madness, but from a need to invert, to release, to reveal how thin the line was between sacred and silly, and perhaps to remind those in power that even their rituals could be borrowed for play. Occasionally these acts turned biting. A miserly landlord might find himself married to a local fool, dragged through the streets as villagers sang songs of his greed. It was jest, yes, but jest with teeth. The church scowled but rarely interfered. Such mischief was too fleeting to punish. Better to let the laughter burn out than to stoke rebellion with censure. I once saw a bishop watch such a wedding from his window, smiling behind his curtain. Not all participants emerged unscathed. Once in Burgundy, a young man refused to play the bride and was pelted with apples until he fled. Another time, the wedding feast ended in a drunken brawl that shattered 3 chairs and left the baker's son limping for a week. Yet even in misfire, these events were remembered fondly. They stitched the community together with threads of absurdity. Bonds formed in jest often held longer than those forged in fear. Songs were composed for these mock unions, rhymes about cows as bridesmaids and priests who wept over spilled wine. Children sang them long after the feast was done. I still remember a verse about a groom who fled into the woods and was married instead to a tree. The tree bore no fruit, but the marriage, they said, was peaceful. In such tales, truth was not the point. The joy was in the telling, and the freedom to say what could not be said in earnest. These ceremonies faded as the years grew heavier. Laws tightened, clergy stiffened, and people forgot how to laugh without permission. But the memory of them lingers in me like the taste of burnt sugar on a winter's day, sweet and strange. I miss the sight of the farmer in a veil, the blacksmith tossing rice made of oats, the children crowning a dog with rosemary. We were foolish, yes, but we were free, if only for an hour. And sometimes, by this fire, I imagine such a wedding happening again, beneath the moon, beside a barn, with music off key and joy unashamed. It may never return in the flesh, but in memory, it still dances. The bride still trips on her boots. The groom still winks at the stars. And the crowd, for once, is one. There were corners of the village where death never truly left, where bones surfaced with every heavy rain, and children learned early not to fear them. I recall one such place behind a crumbled chapel, where the ground had swallowed old graves and returned them half digested. The boys played there, weaving femurs into hurdles, tossing skulls like balls, never thinking to ask whose heads they were. To them, death was not distant. It was familiar, shaped like play. No one scolded them. The priests turned their eyes elsewhere, and the mothers simply washed the dust from their feet when they came home. These remains had lost their names, their prayers, their tombs. They were no longer the dead, they were objects. Once, I saw a girl decorate a skull with flowers, calling it her silent brother. She dressed it in scraps of linen and sang lullabies. No one stopped her. Why would they? We had no better use for the dead. Such play might seem cruel now, but to us, it was natural. Life and death were not strangers but neighbours, leaning over the same fence. We lived among plagues, famines, and wars. Graves overflowed, and mourning became a rhythm rather than a rupture. So when a rib became a flute, or a jawbone a puppet, we did not flinch. We laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was possible to laugh, and that itself was defiance. Some boys carved runes into vertebrae, casting them like dice to tell fortunes or dares. Others played Bone King, where the tallest skull was crowned, and its bearer given silly commands. One game involved stacking bones into towers. The higher the stack, the braver the player. I once saw a tower fall and crush a boy's foot. He howled, not from pain, but from losing. That was how deep the game ran. It blurred everything else. At times, travellers passing through would gape or scold, calling it blasphemy. But the villagers simply shrugged. What else were they to do with so many bones? The ground gave them back, unasked. Better to use them than to pretend they weren't there. I heard of places where bones were burned or buried again and again, but they always returned. The earth, it seemed, had its own sense of mischief. When relics were shown at church, saints' fingers or martyrs' teeth, we knelt in awe. Yet outside, a skull became a toy. This contradiction never troubled us. Sacredness, we believed, was not in the object, but in the story it carried. A bone behind the altar could heal. A bone in the field could entertain. Both were remnants. Both were part of us. We just used them differently. The older we grew, the less we touched them. Reverence returned with age. But I never forgot the feel of bone in hand, light and dry, and the strange joy it once brought. Those games were not mockery, they were remembrance in disguise. Not the solemn remembrance of sermons, but the living kind, the one that breathes, sings, and dares to dance. Now, when I walk past graveyards in silence, I think of those childhood days. Not with shame, but with a quiet kind of wonder. We made joy out of what others feared. And though the bones are still, their echoes remain, whispering of a time when death was part of the game, and the living knew how to laugh with ghosts. There are journeys made on foot, and others carried in boxes of silver and glass. I remember the hush that fell upon a village when word spread that a saint's relic was coming. It might be a finger bone, a scrap of tunic, or a tooth said to gleam in candlelight. Whatever it was, the people believed it had power. Banners were sewn overnight, bells rung until the air trembled, and strangers flooded in from miles around to witness the passing holiness. Merchants arrived first, hawking candles, medals, and tiny flasks, said to have touched the relic. Then came the clergy, swinging incense, their voices thick with chant. At last, beneath a canopy of embroidered silk, came the reliquary itself, shining, carried on shoulders, guarded like a crown. I saw women weep at the sight of it, hands trembling as they reached to touch the glass. Some fainted. Others simply knelt and whispered names too sacred to say aloud in other moments. The atmosphere was like a fair and a funeral entwined. Children laughed while old men prayed. Pilgrims lined up with bruised knees and empty bellies, hoping for a blessing that would heal what no leech or potion could. I recall a blind man who claimed his vision returned for 3 heartbeats when the relic passed. He fell to the ground and kissed the dirt. No one doubted him. We wanted to believe, and so we did. Relics moved across kingdoms, escorted by knights, monks, and sometimes even kings. Their arrival meant more than miracles. It meant coin, recognition, pride. A village that hosted a relic became holy ground, if only for a day. Inns filled, taverns thrived, and the streets pulsed with music and murmurs. Even those who scoffed in private came out to see. Curiosity and faith walk close together, and both have hungry eyes. The stories told about the relics were grand, strange, sometimes impossible. A jawbone that stopped storms, a splinter from the cross that wept blood on Midsummer's Eve, a saint's toe that healed cows. I once saw a cloth said to have wiped St. Agnes's tears. It smelled faintly of lavender and soot. Whether true or not, these objects held something weightier than logic. They carried the weight of collective hope, and that made them sacred enough. Not every relic was authentic, and many suspected it. I knew a priest who confided that his holy tooth belonged to a dog, but it cured ailments nonetheless. Faith, he said with a shrug, needs a vessel. Truth is not always the strongest one. I never forgot that. Perhaps what mattered was not what the relic was, but what it allowed us to feel. A connection, however fragile, to something eternal. Children would press tokens against the reliquary, hoping it would bless the object by touch. I've seen garlands, letters, carved wooden hearts, even locks of hair tied in string. These offerings were left like prayers made visible. Later, They would be hung in homes or worn in pouches around the neck. Protection, remembrance, longing, all bundled into a trinket warmed by faith. No bishop could grant what a child's hope freely gave. When the relic departed, the village always felt quieter, as if something luminous had passed through and taken a piece of our breath with it. The streets emptied, the stalls packed, the candles burned low. But for days, the air shimmered with that strange mix of joy and ache. We had touched the sacred, or at least believed we had, and that belief lingered like incense in the rafters of the soul. Not all contests were fought with swords or honor-bound rules. In many villages, strength was measured by the grip of arms and the dirt on your back. I remember one festival in Brabant, where men stripped to their waists in the shadow of the church and wrestled before the gathered crowd. No titles were at stake, no bloodline mattered, only muscle, balance, and pride. The air smelled of sweat and cider, and wages changed hands as quickly as insults. It was crude, but honest. These matches followed loose customs, passed down like bread recipes. You stood in a ring marked by stones or ropes, locked arms with your opponent, and tried to throw him to the ground. There were no time limits, no referees, only the crowd's roar to judge the fall. Sometimes the loser walked away with laughter, other times with a limp and a broken tooth. But the bruises earned were worn like medals, and the winners held high by their kin. In coastal towns, wrestling gave way to outright brawls. Whole streets turned into battlegrounds for rival parishes or guilds. I once watched two baker's apprentices scrap over a dropped pie, and by dusk, half the village had joined in. It ended only when the priest rang the bell and reminded them of tomorrow's mass. Still, a few punches were thrown, even as they crossed themselves. Such was the closeness of sin and celebration. There was a beauty in the chaos. The grunts, the quick footwork, the way sweat gleamed on skin beneath the summer sun. Boys learned by mimicking their older brothers. Girls cheered from fences, and old men offered tips no one asked for. You did not need coin to play, only the will to stand and the strength to fall with dignity. For a moment, every man was equal beneath the weight of another's body. Not all matches were fair. Some greased their arms, others hid pebbles in their hands. I saw one lad bite when the crowd couldn't see. But justice of a sort always came. Cheaters were mocked, denied ale, or invited to fight again in darker corners. The community remembered who played true. In places where law was distant and lords uncaring, this was its own kind of court. These contests often followed feasts or church services, as if the body demanded something after the soul had been fed. I recall one Easter morning where, after communion, two shepherds settled a long-standing dispute by grappling in a muddy yard. They rose, laughing, robes torn, their sheep watching from the hill. Later that day, they shared a jug of mead and a haunch of ham. Whatever divided them had been left in the mud. Women rarely fought, though they were not absent. I knew a brewer's daughter who challenged any man to a grip test, most lost. She never wrestled in the ring, but she was feared more than many who did. And once in secret, I saw two girls practicing behind the smithy, their laughter sharp as sparks. Strength, it seemed, lived where it chose, regardless of custom or name. Now and then, my old bones remember those contests, the rush of adrenaline, the taste of blood in the mouth, the moment of lift and fall. It was not war, not sport as we name it now, but something raw and binding. To wrestle was to speak without words, to learn someone through contact, resistance, and breath. And though my limbs are slow now, the memory moves quick in me still. Some wisdom came not from books or pulpits, but from women who lived at the edge of the woods, their windows veiled with herbs, their floors swept with salt. I visited such a cottage once in the Black Forest, where an old woman read my palm beneath a string of drying apples. Her fingers were cold, her voice low, and when she told me I would cross water before blood, I laughed. Years later, on a bridge in Ghent, I held my brother as he died. Her words returned like smoke. People feared them, but they also came knocking. Farmers seeking signs of weather, mothers hoping to cure fevers, lovers asking if their hearts would be returned. The fortune teller offered no certainty, only glimpses, patterns in wax or ash, bones cast in circles, cards painted with strange beasts. I once watched a widow weep over a turnip carved to show the face of her late husband. No one questioned it. The dead speak in symbols, and she had needed to hear. Not all who claimed the craft were kind. Some cheated, some threatened, some took coin and offered nonsense. But the true ones, those who listened as much as they spoke, held a strange respect in the village. Their words lingered longer than sermons. They blended prayer and superstition, saint and spell, psalm and proverb, until it was hard to know where faith ended and magic began. And perhaps that was the point. The world did not divide so easily. In the market squares, there were travelling seers who painted their faces, told fortunes for pennies, and left before nightfall. I saw one who used a mirror to reveal a person's true self. The crowd gasped when a drunkard saw his own father's face in the glass. Whether it was trickery or truth, it struck him deeply. He knelt. Not every revelation brings joy, but even sorrow can feel like clarity. That was the gift they gave, not answers, but insight. Charms passed from hand to hand, ribbons tied with knots, teeth in pouches, iron nails soaked in milk. These were not toys, but protections. One girl kept a frog's foot beneath her pillow to ward off nightmares. Another carved a symbol on her door to keep her child from choking in sleep. We did not always believe, but we did not dare ignore. The old ways held power, if only because we gave it to them. The church condemned much of it, though priests themselves sometimes came in secret. A bishop once paid a charm maker to bless his horse before battle. I know because I delivered the coin. He called it nonsense, but he still tied the charm to the saddle. Faith, in all its forms, is a net cast wide. When life is uncertain and death close, one prays in every direction. Light a candle, speak a spell, cross your fingers. It all comes from the same hunger. There were festivals where folk magic became spectacle, where fortunes were told aloud before crowds. I remember one Whitsun Eve where the village elder read fire patterns from a burning sheaf. The people gasped when the flames split in two. A sign, they said, that twins would be born before harvest. And they were. It changed nothing, perhaps, but it filled the days with story, and that made the hard months easier. I never called myself a believer, yet I kept a stone in my satchel for 20 years, smooth and black, said to protect travellers. Whether it did or not, I cannot say. But when I held it, I remembered all those nights I survived, all those roads I returned from. Perhaps that is the only magic that matters, the kind that reminds us we are still here, still walking, still hoping. In towns where wonder was scarce, the arrival of a dancing bear or a prancing goat brought the streets to life. I remember standing shoulder to shoulder with villagers as a man in patched trousers led a monkey through the square, dressed in noble robes and offering tiny salutes. The children shrieked with delight, tossing crusts of bread toward the creature. Even the sternest elders softened for a moment. These animals, trained in odd tricks, became symbols of joy and strangeness, living curiosities in a world otherwise weighed by labour. Some were exotic, brought from distant ports by merchants who spoke in half-truths. I saw once a man claim his mongoose had fought serpents in the deserts of the Holy Land. Another led a small deer with golden painted hooves, calling it a heavenly beast that bowed only to priests. We knew most of it was nonsense, but we played along. In their fur and feathers, we glimpsed something beyond the fields we knew. It was a way to touch faraway lands without ever leaving the mud. These processions often accompanied fairs or feast days, marching between stalls of cheese and linen, where jugglers and musicians added to the chaos. There might be a goose who played a tiny bell, or a pig that counted to 5 with its hooves. I once saw a rooster pull a cart of mice dressed as soldiers. No one asked how it was done. We only clapped and laughed, grateful for the absurdity. It reminded us that not all surprises had to come with thunder or tears. Of course, the animals themselves were not always willing participants. The bear's dance came at the tug of a chain. The monkey flinched at the crack of a stick. We pretended not to see. It is easier to enjoy the illusion when you ignore the rope behind the curtain. Some wept for them. Others simply gave an extra crust. Compassion and curiosity lived side by side, rarely speaking but always aware of each other. Stranger still were the pets kept by nobles, chosen not for loyalty but for novelty. I once served a baroness who kept a raven that spoke Latin better than her priest. A French lord owned a leopard that dined on pheasant beside him, its eyes never blinking. These creatures became trophies of distance, proof that their masters had seen more of the world than the rest of us. They were not friends, only ornaments that breathed. Legends grew around the most famous beasts, a cat that healed the dying, a goat that predicted the harvest, a swan that refused to fly until a king had repented. Whether any of it was true did not matter. The stories lived longer than the animals, passed down in songs and whispers. In them, the mundane transformed. A creature became a prophet, a trick became a miracle, and for a moment, we believed the world still held secrets. Children adored these visits most. They mimicked the animals, played games where they led each other on pretend parades through the fields. I watched once as a boy tied flowers to his dog's ears and declared it the emperor of sheep. The dog wagged, the others bowed, and the moment, though fleeting, was as real as any coronation. It is through such games that we learn to see magic in motion. Now, when birds perch near my fire or a fox stares too long from the woods, I think of those days. Of the parades, the painted hooves, the monkey in a velvet hat. And I wonder if the animals remember us too, not as masters, not as tormentors, but as strange companions in a world too heavy to carry alone. For a brief hour, they led us somewhere lighter, and that is not so small a gift. When the rains came heavy and the fields turned to muck, we gathered indoors and passed the hours in games of chance and wit. In taverns, cloisters, and manor halls, boards were drawn into the wood of tables, worn smooth by years of play. Dice clattered across planks like hail on rooftops, and the shuffle of tokens became its own kind of music. There were few rules written down, but many remembered. And always, someone swore the dice were cursed. In noble courts, games like chess and tables, what we now call backgammon, held a quiet prestige. To play well was to show control, patience, and mind. I watched knights study each other over carved pieces, moving kings and bishops as if commanding real battles. Queens had strange power in these games, freer than in life. A pawn reaching the far edge of the board could become anything. It was a comforting fiction. The poor seldom reached the other side. Among peasants, the games were rougher, faster, louder. We rolled bones on dirt floors, etched with crude symbols, and gambled with crusts, nails, or promises. One man bet his boots and walked home barefoot through frost. Another swore he'd marry the miller's daughter if he lost, and did. There was laughter and scorn, and sometimes fists, but mostly it was a way to escape the cold, a way to forget the hunger behind the laughter. The church frowned on dice and called it the devil's game. They said soldiers cast lots for Christ's garments, and no holy man should follow their example. But even monks, in the quiet corners of the cloister, played games with numbered stones. I once caught two scribes arguing over a move in Alquerque while pretending to copy psalms. They looked guilty when I passed, but I only smiled. The mind needs its own rest, even in sacred walls. Superstition crept in like smoke. Some dice were blessed, others buried for a night beneath crossroads to bring luck. Players spat on their hands, whispered charms, tapped wood before a throw. I saw one man wear a dead bird's claw around his neck, claiming it turned ill rolls. He lost every round, but never removed it. Faith is a stubborn thing, especially when tied to fortune. We wanted to believe we could influence chaos. Arguments were common. Rules were interpreted differently from town to town, sometimes from table to table. A miscount could lead to insults, a bad throw to accusations of cheating. Yet these disputes rarely lasted. The game mattered, yes, but not more than the companionship it brought. In a world that often divided by rank, these boards offered rare equality. Rich and poor alike leaned forward with the same hope in their eyes. Children, too, had their own versions. Games played with pebbles or marked tiles, passed down in whispers from older siblings. I watched a girl in Lincoln beat 3 boys twice her size, using a fox and geese board scratched into the earth with a stick. She grinned with all her teeth, and they sulked but smiled. It was the only battle she could win in that world, and she claimed it fully. These games gave voice to those too often silent. Now, as the firelight flickers and the wind presses against the door, I remember the feel of smooth tokens in my palm, the silence before a throw, the burst of laughter after a twist of fate. We played not because it changed the world, but because it made the world feel lighter. For a few moments, all was within reach: a queen's power, a peasant's triumph, a chance to win back what had been lost. And that, in our coldest months, was enough. There was a peculiar sound that echoed through crowded squares, not the clash of swords or sermons, but the scream of laughter tangled with pain. I first heard it in Rouen, where a man in a red cap stood atop a cart, waving a gleaming pair of tongs like a scepter. He claimed to cure headaches, toothaches, and heartbreak, all with a single pull. The crowd gathered tight, half for the cure, half for the show. He worked with a drummer and a boy who danced. It was a spectacle before it was a service. The afflicted came forward one by one, holding cheeks swollen like fruit, some weeping, others grinning in defiance. They climbed the cart as if ascending to judgment. The tooth drawer bowed, prayed loudly, then yanked with a flourish that made the crowd gasp. Sometimes the tooth came clean, sometimes not. A scream, a spurt of blood, and the applause followed. He'd toss the tooth into a jar and hold it aloft like a relic. Pain had become theatre. Children mimicked him with wooden spoons and carrots, chasing each other through the crowd. Vendors sold ginger to chew and vinegars to rinse the mouth. I remember a baker who offered bread crusts, safe for the toothless. It was all part of the charm. Even those who needed no pulling came to watch. There was something irresistible in seeing pain transformed into performance, something ancient and strange. Healers like him travelled from town to town, their wagons painted with saints, herbs, and absurd claims. Some truly believed in their work. Others simply learned the right words and the bold stance. I saw one draw 3 teeth from a man who had only one aching. When asked why, he replied, "So the others won't envy." The man, drunk and dazed, nodded solemnly. Laughter roared, coins dropped, and the cart moved on. There were those who tried to ban them. Guilds of surgeons claimed it was unholy, unclean, untrained. Priests called it vanity dressed in blood. Yet they always returned, welcomed more as jesters than medics. They brought colour to the market, noise to the stillness, and a certain reckless hope. In a world of long suffering and slow death, a quick pull and loud cheer felt almost divine. Some shows ended badly. A jaw broken, an artery nicked, a fever after the fact. I heard of a woman who bit down mid-pull and nearly severed the man's finger. Another time, a crowd turned on the performer when a child died days after a tooth was taken. But these were rare. Most chose to remember the laughter, the relief, the strange dance of healing and harm. There was pride in enduring the pull. I once saw a boy of 12 sit silent as a stone while the tooth came loose, then hold it up like a trophy. his father wept. Not from pity, but pride. Strength in those moments was not measured in battles, but in stillness beneath the tongs. The square echoed with music, blood, and the hush that follows shared awe. I think of those carts now, long vanished, wheels rotted, drums silent. But the memory remains of courage on wooden platforms, of smiles torn open to let the pain fly free. We cheered not just for the show, but for the reminder that even suffering could be faced with laughter, and even a scream could sound like song when the right hands held the tongs. The scent of roasted meat, pitch, and sweat filled the air long before you reached the edge of the fairground. These gatherings were more than trade. They were worlds stitched together for a brief breath of time. I remember walking past stalls draped in foreign silks, hearing 3 languages before I reached the bread cart. Laughter chased arguments, drums chased silence, and everywhere you turned, something begged to be believed. It was chaos, yes, but a joyous kind, a market for both goods and wonder. At the heart of it all stood the sideshows, where the strange and unseen were offered for coin. A bearded woman sang psalms through tears. A man with no legs raced children on his hands. There was a boy called the Snake, whose limbs bent like rope, and a girl who slept in a glass box, never waking. They were neither mocked nor pitied, only watched. Our hunger for marvels was louder than our discomfort. The shows promised wonders, but rarely truth. A fish with a human face, a monkey called a forest baby, a pair of conjoined twins who juggled knives while reciting scripture. Some were real, others illusions crafted with wax, mirrors, or clever speech. Yet no one complained. The lie was part of the purchase. We wanted to believe that the world still held secrets, that there were corners untouched by our daily drudgery. Performers honed their art with sharp timing and sharper tongues. I saw one man who claimed he could swallow fire and spit the names of angels. Another juggled eggs while reciting a saint's martyrdom in rhyme. They shouted, flirted, wept, and leapt in boots tied with bells. They were poets and hustlers, prophets and thieves. But above all, they were needed. In their madness, we found reflection. Some of the strange ones spoke little. They sat beneath canopies, blinking at the sun, letting others tell their stories. A woman covered in hair was called Wolf Saint by the barker beside her. She simply smiled, eating an apple. I once offered her bread. She took it gently and nodded, her eyes far older than mine. Whatever tale was told about her, I felt none of it needed words. Children clung to their mothers, equal parts thrilled and afraid. They stared at a man who could fold himself into a barrel, a woman with silver-painted eyes who claimed to read dreams. The line between awe and fear is narrow when you're young. These sights stayed with them longer than any prayer. Perhaps that was why parents brought them, to shape a kind of reverence, however crooked. Merchants sold relics from the show, locks of hair, feathers, small painted portraits. I knew one boy who carried a bone said to belong to a giant baby for years. He swore it kept wolves away. Whether it worked or not, it gave him courage, and that is worth more than proof. We wrapped the unknown in ritual and wore it like armor. The fairs packed up fast, vanishing as if they'd never been. But their memory lingered, strange shapes beneath the skin of the ordinary. We returned to fields, and firesides changed in some small, secret way. Not wiser, perhaps, but widened. For even if the marvels were faked, the wonder was real. And that, in the end, was the only truth that mattered. You could hear it long before you saw the crowd, lutes being tuned, voices clearing, the rising hum of competition masked as melody. I remember one midsummer's night in Winchester, when they gathered by torchlight to sing for pride, love, and a pitcher of spiced wine. Some were troubadours draped in colours, their songs practiced and polished like armour. Others were millers or shepherd girls, rough in tone but rich in heart. It mattered little. When the first voice rose, Silence fell like a blessing. These contests were not born of vanity, but of survival. A good ballad could earn you lodging, coin, or the glance of someone too fine for your station. I once watched a toothless ploughman outsing a night's sun with a love song that made half the women in the square sigh. Words, when sung well, carried more weight than title. That night, the ploughman left with his pockets full and his arms full too. Music made the world fairer, if only for a verse. There were rules, sometimes. Verses had to rhyme, or mention a local river, or end with a prayer. Other times, the only law was the crowd's whim. I saw a woman win with a lullaby no one had heard since childhood. Half forgotten, half imagined. It brought tears, and that was enough. These songs were more than entertainment. They were vessels of memory, holding sorrow and sweetness together in fragile tune. Minstrels travelled far to join the contests, their satchels full of parchment and promises. Some came with stories stolen from distant lands, wrapped in rhyme and dust. They sang of dragons, saints, forbidden love, or harvest ghosts. I heard one sing the confession of a tree that watched a murder. No one knew what it meant, but everyone clapped. The song didn't need to be true. It only needed to make us feel. Occasionally, rivals would meet on stage. They'd exchange verses like blows, one rhyming insult after another, until the crowd burst with laughter or gasped in awe. These battles of wit were sharper than steel, and more dangerous in some ways. A poorly chosen word could lose you the crowd, but a clever turn could make you a legend. I remember one girl who ended her verse by kissing her opponent's cheek. The crowd roared. He blushed and forgot his next line. Children imitated what they heard, forming their own contests in muddy courtyards, with sticks for lutes and songs about bread or bees. I watched a boy sing to a hen and win a coin from a passing knight. He never forgot it. That small tune carried him through a long winter, and likely many more. In a world where voice could feed you, song became a kind of tool, rough but mighty. Not all songs were welcome. Some veiled truths about lords, taxes, or priests behind clever metaphors. A ballad could start a fire if sung in the wrong place. I knew a singer who vanished after performing a tale about a king who stole from widows. The next contest, no one mentioned him, but his song lingered like smoke. Music was both balm and blade, and we all knew it. I still hum the melodies when the night grows long. Even now, I remember the rise and fall of those brave voices, some trembling, some bold, all reaching for something more than applause. They sang to be remembered, to be heard, to become part of the great woven song that stretches across time. And in listening, we became part of it too. Fashion was never just for comfort. It was a language louder than banners, and in some years, more absurd than anything a fool could invent. I remember passing through Paris and seeing young nobles hobbling on shoes with points so long they had to tie them to their knees with ribbons. They called them poulains. I called them foolish. But they strutted with pride, dragging their silken absurdities through mud like kings of some invisible court. No one dared laugh too loud. After all, wealth forgives many sins. The stranger the fashion, the higher the status, or so it seemed. Hoods shaped like bird beaks, sleeves that reached the ground, tunics slit so high one feared the wind might carry modesty away. I saw a man once wearing a hat shaped like a cathedral spire, his servant walking behind to keep it steady. In courts, such things were praised as daring. In fields, we called them mad. But even the farmers tried to copy with scraps and stitched cloth. Colours, too, spoke louder than speech. A splash of crimson meant power. A deep green hinted at wealth. Bright yellow whispered scandal. Dyes were expensive, stolen from plants and beetles and guarded like gold. To wear them was to declare yourself seen. I recall a woman who wore robes so blue they shimmered like river water. None knew her name, but all turned to watch her pass. She left no footprints, only envy. The church grumbled endlessly about vanity, declaring each new trend a sin wrapped in thread. Yet bishops themselves wore robes longer than any nobles, and rings that could ransom a village. I once heard a friar preach against fashion, while wearing boots so polished they blinded in the sun. We nodded, of course, and then returned to lengthening our sleeves and trimming our beards into improbable shapes. Some garments were made not to impress, but to mock. Festival days brought out costumes so ludicrous they bent the spine. Padded stomachs, wooden wigs, false noses, worn to ridicule the proud and remind us all of our shared absurdity. There was joy in the mockery. For one day, the tailor ruled over the knight, the jester over the baron, and laughter, sharper than scissors, stitched us together. It wasn't only the nobles who played the game. I knew a pig herder who wore a feathered cap each Sunday, claiming it kept his thoughts from escaping. A blacksmith who laced his boots with twine dyed with berry juice. These flourishes meant nothing and everything. They were gestures of rebellion, of self-worth, of saying, I too am seen. In a world that often forgot the poor, colour became a cry. Of course, fashion had its dangers. Points could trip you, sleeves catch fire, corsets crush ribs. I saw a young squire faint from heat because his velvet doublet was lined with wool in midsummer. His lady said it was romantic. I thought it was foolishness woven in gold. But perhaps that was the point. To suffer a little for the sake of being noticed. To declare yourself alive in a world that often blurred you into the crowd. I've kept no fine garments. Only a wool cloak patched too many times to count. Yet in dreams, I sometimes wear those pointed shoes and walk among mirrors, laughing. Not at them, but with them. For though the fashions faded, the desire remained, to be more than the body, more than the mud, more than the hunger, to shine, even briefly, like silk in the rain. There are customs that sound strange in hindsight, yet in their time felt as ordinary as bread or prayer. Bloodletting was one of them. I recall mornings when neighbours gathered outside the barber surgeon's door, sleeves already rolled, chatting as if they awaited a feast. The sick came for healing. The healthy came to balance their humours. It was a ritual both medical and communal, a mingling of pain, trust, and strange companionship. The bowl filled slowly, and no one flinched. The barber surgeon's shop was half infirmary, half tavern. You could lose blood and gain gossip in the same breath. I watched an old man joke through the whole procedure, his face pale but his wit sharp. When he left, others clapped his back and called him brave. There was pride in taking the blade without complaint, and perhaps, in a world where we bled from battle and childbirth, choosing when to bleed gave a sense of power. Sometimes the blood was taken from the arm, other times from behind the ear or even the ankle. Cups were used too, glass domes heated and placed on skin to draw out the redness. I saw one woman faint not from the blood, but from the sight of her neighbour's face beneath the suctioned skin. Still, she returned the next month. The ritual had its rhythm. To skip it felt like inviting illness, or worse, bad luck. Superstition wrapped around the practice like ivy on stone. It was said that bleeding under the full moon cured melancholy. Others swore by Fridays for headaches and Tuesdays for fevers. A butcher once told me he scheduled his cuts by the same calendar. Whether truth or not, the belief gave structure, and structure gave comfort. In uncertain times, even a poor cure is better than none at all. Children watched from doorways, eyes wide with awe and unease. They mimicked the procedure in play, using sticks and berries for blades and blood. One boy tried it on a chicken and was chased through the village. Still, they learned. Not from books, but from watching the rituals of their elders. The body was a mystery, but one they dared to explore with hands, not just prayers. The wealthy had their own tools, leeches kept in jars, ornate basins carved with saints. I once saw a lord surgeon wrap a bleeding arm in silk, as if style could ease suffering. but the process was the same. A cut, a pause, a cloth pressed to slow the flow. Status meant little when the blood ran red. For a brief moment, all were equal in their frailty. Over time, some began to question the wisdom of it. A new generation of healers, armed with charts and skepticism, spoke of infection, of harm. But the habit remained. People trusted what they could feel, what they could see. A bowl of blood felt like proof that something had been done. And in that visible offering, they placed their hope. Fragile, perhaps, but sincere. Now, when my bones ache and memory stirs old pain, I do not long for the knife. But I remember those mornings well, the hush before the cut, the murmur of shared worry, the warmth of cloth pressed to flesh. It was more than medicine. It was a moment of belonging, of being seen and treated, not just as a patient, but as a soul worth tending. Not all contests needed armor or gold to stir the hearts of a crowd. Some began in open fields with nothing more than a ball made of rags and a stick smoothed by use. I remember passing through Sussex in spring and seeing a game of stool ball played in the churchyard. Young women striking a ball tossed toward them, while others laughed and dove to catch it. Their skirts flew, their cheeks flushed, and their joy rang louder than the church bells. There was no prize, only delight. They said the game was for courting, but not all played sweetly. I saw a girl knock a boy to the dirt with a swing, and he rose grinning, bruised and smitten. The rules shifted with each village, each match. In some places, the goal was to defend a stool from being hit. In others, to run in circles, as in the Roman games. It mattered little. The game lived through laughter, not laws. Other sports were rougher, rowdier, and far less graceful. Mob football was one such chaos. I once watched an entire village split into two sides, chasing a ball through rivers, over fences, and even through a startled hen house. There were no boundaries, no timekeepers. You played until the sun fell, or the ball was lost, or someone broke a limb. And even then, the victor was rarely clear, except in the telling. In these games, all joined in, men, boys, sometimes women when no one stopped them. The butcher tackled the priest, the blacksmith threw the reeve into a puddle, and the baker's apprentice was crowned champion for holding the ball atop a haystack for half an hour. For one afternoon, hierarchy dissolved. Mud was the great leveller, and bruises the only medals awarded. It was madness, and it was marvellous. Some sports used animals, though not always wisely. I saw a goat chase boys in a circle while they tried to snatch ribbons from its horns. In another town, they placed a greased pig in the square, and whoever caught it kept it. I remember the noise, the squeals of beast and man alike, the shrieks of onlookers, the tumbling bodies. It was not elegant, but it was honest, and we needed that. There were gentler games too. Bowls rolled across green lawns, quoits tossed at pegs, games of shuttlecock played with paddles fashioned from wood scraps. Old men played as eagerly as children, placing small wagers or none at all. It was not about victory, but participation, about sharing time, motion, and breath in a world often too still. These games filled the quiet spaces left by toil and worry. Church officials sometimes objected, especially when play crept too close to sacred hours or graveyards. But more often than not, they watched from a distance, arms crossed but eyes amused. Even the sternest of men softened when a child scored a clever point, or an old woman outpaced a squire. Joy, after all, can be persuasive. And sport, in its simplest form, asks nothing more than attention and effort. As I sit here now, listening to the wind brush through trees like distant applause, I think of those games, not for their skill or spectacle, but for their spirit. We did not need rules carved in stone or arenas of grandeur. We needed only each other, a bit of space, and the will to play. And in those fleeting hours, muddy and breathless, we remembered what it was to be fully alive. There was a time when skeletons danced in the village square. not in fear, but in jest, in warning, in art. Painted on church walls, etched into manuscripts, and in some places acted out in flesh and bone, this dance of death reminded us all that no man outruns the grave. I once watched it performed beside a plague pit, the actors moving with slow, swaying steps, their faces hidden behind grinning skull masks. The crowd did not laugh, nor weep. They simply watched, as if staring into their own reflection. The figures came in a procession, a king, a knight, a priest, a farmer, a child, all led by death itself, tapping a drum or playing a flute. Each resisted in their own way, offering bribes, prayers, or pleas. But none escaped the final dance. That was the lesson. No crown, no coin, no cradle could hold back the bony hand. And yet, in its grim rhythm, there was a strange comfort. Equality in the end, even if not in life. These performances blurred the line between play and ritual. Some were silent, others sung. I recall one where the dead spoke in rhyme, chiding the living with lines like sharpened thorns. You built your house in golden stone, but now you dance, and dance alone. The crowd murmured as if at sermon, and in a way, it was. A sermon in movement, in mask, in shadow. Children watched from behind skirts, peeking with wide eyes. They learned early that life ends, but also that art can make sense of what we fear. I saw a boy join in the dance, too young to know what it meant, yet his joy softened the edge. Even death, in costume, paused to ruffle his hair. For a moment, laughter and loss sat side by side, like old friends who no longer argued. Painters and poets embraced the motif, crafting images and verses that echoed through halls and homes. I remember a fresco near Lübeck, so vivid you could hear the clatter of bones in your mind. A merchant clung to his ledger, a queen her pearls, but death touched them both with equal grace. The colours have faded, but the lesson remains, etched deep into stone and soul alike. These dances often followed plague years, when death had already marched through every door uninvited. They were not meant to scare, but to reflect, to remind. We wore black, but we danced. We buried, but we sang. It was not defiance exactly, it was acceptance woven with music. A ritual that said, we are still here, still breathing, still aware. Not everyone approved. Some called it morbid, irreverent, even sinful, but others understood its purpose. A miller once told me it made him less afraid to die, because if death could be danced with, perhaps it could be met without shame. I never forgot that. Even now, when my breath shortens, I think of that miller's smile and the skeleton's gentle bow. I hear no music now but the crackle of fire, yet in my mind the dancers still move, across cobbled squares, between graves, through memory. They carry no swords, only truth. And when my turn comes, I hope to step lightly, to join that final procession, not with dread, but with grace. For all who live must someday follow. But until then, we watch, we remember, and we carry the rhythm in our bones. Grief wears many faces, and in our time, it often wore a smile hidden behind tears. When someone died, the village gathered, not only to mourn, but to remember through story, song, and shared bread. I have sat at many wakes, candlelight flickering across pale linen, as the departed lay in silence while the living filled the room with life. Children played near the hearth, elders sipped ale, and someone always began a tale before long. Death, after all, does not ask for silence. It invites memory. The body was rarely left alone. Neighbours took turns sitting beside it, whispering prayers, crossing themselves, or simply breathing in the quiet. Some believed the soul lingered near, listening. So we spoke kindly, even if the dead had not always earned it. A blacksmith once confessed to stealing apples as a boy beside the body of the man who'd chased him. Let him take the truth with him, he said. We laughed. It felt right. Food was a constant. Trays of bread, cheese, stewed meats, and sometimes sweet cakes shaped like bones or doves. It was not feasting in celebration, but in communion. We ate what the departed loved most, toasted their quirks, and let the flavors carry the weight of remembrance. I once attended a wake where everyone drank from the same wooden cup, carved by the man who had just died. It passed hand to hand like a relic. Even those who disliked him drank. There was music too. A slow fiddle, a flute, or just the hum of old songs carried on tired voices. I remember one widow who sang through the night, her voice thin but unbroken, as if each note tied her husband's soul to the stars. No one interrupted. We wept into our mugs and held each other tighter. Sometimes music heals better than any priest's blessing. It gives form to what words cannot. Games were played and jokes were told. This might seem strange, but laughter at a wake was not disrespect. It was tribute. To laugh in the face of death was to affirm life. A jester once performed beside the bier of a nobleman who had loved riddles. He wore black bells and danced a crooked jig, and though some were shocked, the noble's son said he would have liked it. And we believed it. That night, sorrow danced with joy, and neither felt out of place. Children often did not understand the finality. They touched the shrouded hands, asked questions no one dared answer, and fell asleep under tables. But they learned by watching how we honored, how we remembered. They saw death not as a terror, but as a passage, wrapped in story and song. I once gave a boy my own candle to hold through the vigil. Years later, he lit one for me. The circle never broke. Not every wake was warm. Some brought tension, old feuds resurfacing beside cold flesh. But even then, something softened. A shared glance, a prayer said through clenched teeth. Death had a way of quieting the loudest pride. In its stillness, grudges lost their shape. I've seen hands shake that hadn't touched in decades, all because someone's breath had ceased. The dead could teach peace better than the living. When I think back on the best of us, I don't see them in battle or glory. I see them at their own wakes, surrounded by those who knew them truly. Not saints, not villains, just people held in memory. We let them go not in silence, but in stories told by firelight, with plates scraped clean and cups run dry. In death, we did not forget how to live. We simply lived a little more deeply, so their echo would never fade. Few stories raised more eyebrows than those of animals standing before a judge. It sounds like fable, but I assure you, it happened. I once rode through a village in Burgundy where a sow had been arrested for killing a child. She was held in a cell, given a lawyer, and eventually hanged from the gallows, as if she'd known right from wrong. People came from miles to witness it, half in horror, half in morbid curiosity. Law, it seemed, did not always separate man from beast. Cats, cows, roosters, even insects found themselves summoned by court orders. Monks once sued weevils for destroying vineyards, arguing their hunger was an offense to God and man alike. The weevils, of course, did not attend, but the trial went on regardless. Legal minds debated their intent, their purpose, their soul. In one strange twist, a judge offered the insects alternative land to live on. They declined, by not moving. The case was dismissed. These trials were not jokes, though many laughed at them later. They were acts of order in a world full of chaos. If a beast could harm, it could also be punished. That was the logic. And in punishing it, perhaps people felt safer, less helpless. When a pig gored a child, it wasn't just an accident. It became an offense against the village. And in that courtroom, justice gave the illusion that nature could be tamed. I once met a friar who defended a goat accused of witchcraft. He argued the beast was innocent, that the strange noises it made were not spells, but sickness. He wept when they found it guilty and burned it anyway. If we judge animals as men, he told me, we should expect them to speak in their defense. He left the order soon after, disillusioned with the world's sense of fairness. The spectacle drew crowds. People dressed in their best and packed bread to watch the procession. Children sat on shoulders, pointing at the animal tied with rope, flanked by guards. Some cheered, some prayed. I once saw a man bet on whether the accused would squeal at the gallows. That day, it did. And the laughter that followed was strange and sour, like joy gone sour in the sun. Not all ended in death. Some animals were exiled, beaten, or simply blessed and sent away. In rare cases, they were pardoned. I read once of a rooster who had laid an egg, seen as a sign of witchery, but the priest declared it a miracle instead. They built a shrine to the bird. Such were the contradictions of faith and fear, stitched together by stories and need. To modern ears, it sounds absurd, but then we forget how much we feared the unknown. Disease, famine, madness, they came without warning. And if a rat could be blamed, judged, and sentenced, then perhaps chaos could be boxed and buried. These trials were less about guilt and more about control. And in that court, even silence was a kind of testimony. Looking back, I can't say whether the beasts were truly judged, or if we were the ones on trial. For every rope around a pig's neck, there was a man convinced the world had rules, that justice was real even in barns and fields. Perhaps that belief, strange as it was, held the village together better than truth ever could. And maybe, in the end, that was enough. The calendar was filled with holy days meant for prayer, but often they turned into something far wilder. I recall one Christmas Eve in Ghent, where the streets were lined not with pilgrims, but with drunkards in masks, shouting songs that mocked the saints. What began in the chapel spilled into the alleys, with torches waving and dice rolling in the snow. The priest preached about reverence, but the people's hearts longed for release. And so the sacred day twisted into revelry. Easter brought its own chaos. I once saw a group of young men dress as apostles, not in honor, but in jest. They danced through the village square with baskets of eggs, pelting anyone who would not join. Even the women who scolded them laughed when they were struck. Beneath the mockery was a simple truth. Life was hard, and joy, even poorly dressed, was precious. Faith might ask for stillness, but the body demanded movement. On All Hallows' Eve, the line between piety and mischief blurred most of all. Fires blazed, masks hid faces, and some swore spirits walked among us. While the church held vigils, the villagers played tricks, moving wagons, tying doors shut, or smearing soot on doorways. It was said to confuse evil spirits, but mostly it delighted the living. I once spent the night chasing my stolen cloak through 3 fields, laughing so hard I forgot my own anger. Even the solemn feast of saints turned upside down at times. Children dressed as bishops, ringing bells and demanding treats from house to house. They were called boy bishops, and for one day they ruled with a comical authority. They blessed geese, cursed muddy boots, and led processions that no real bishop would dare allow. Some frowned at this inversion of power, but most clapped and sang along. Perhaps we all craved a day when rules bent like reeds. Drinking was never far from these occasions. Cider flowed in barrels, alehouses swelled until the doors creaked, and songs grew louder as the night deepened. I saw a man once climb the church steeple just to place a garland on the weather vane, cheered on by half the town. The next day, he confessed to the priest with a grin and a hangover. The priest scolded him softly, but I saw his lips twitch as though hiding a smile. There were games too, riddles shouted across bonfires, mock duels fought with sticks, and contests to leap over flames. Some claimed these traditions kept away misfortune, others that they brought blessings for the coming year. Whether true or not, they bound the village together. For a few hours, we were no longer lords and peasants, sinners and saints. We were simply people, laughing at the same flames, sharing the same bread. Not everyone approved, of course. Edicts were issued, punishments threatened, but such warnings rarely held. You cannot command joy, nor can you fully banish it. The harder they tried to restrain these celebrations, the louder they became. It was as if the soul needed these cracks in the walls of order, a time to shout, to dance, to remember that life was still sweet, even when burdened by fear and faith. When I close my eyes, I can still see the torches flickering on holy nights, the stars above, watching like silent witnesses. It was not always reverence that filled the air, but something equally human, a hunger for both the sacred and the foolish, braided together like threads of the same cloth. And perhaps that was the real miracle, that we found a way to laugh under the shadow of the church and still call it holy. And so, through mud and firelight, feast and folly, the Dark Ages revealed themselves not as a time of endless gloom, but as a mirror to the soul, raw, restless, and reaching for meaning. Beneath the weight of superstition and war, people still carved out moments of joy, ritual, rebellion, and strange delight. They sang when they should have wept, they danced when they should have prayed, and in doing so, they made the shadows bearable. Every odd tradition, every lawless celebration was a defiant whisper. We are still alive. The stories may seem foolish to modern minds, but they carried the pulse of real people, hungry for laughter, desperate for wonder, and bound by a world they did not fully understand.